You have heard the sentence. You have likely seen it stitched onto banners, printed on bookmarks, and spoken quietly at funerals. But when the Apostle Paul writes the words, "To die is gain," he is doing something far more subversive than most modern readers realize. First, consider how we usually hear it. Most people assume these words are the quiet sigh of an exhausted missionary. We imagine Paul sitting in a dark cell, tired of the beatings, tired of the shipwrecks, tired of the resistance. We read the phrase as a kind of spiritual resignation. We think Paul is simply saying that heaven is a better place, and he is finally ready to go there. That sounds pious. It sounds relatable, but it is not what Paul is doing. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, is not a sentimental journal entry about wanting to escape a hard life. It is a defiant, airtight, logical trap. To see the trap, we have to look at where Paul is sitting. He is in chains. He is a prisoner of Rome. He is writing to the church in Philippi, a city that prides itself on being a miniature version of the capital, filled with retired soldiers and fierce imperial loyalty. And Paul is waiting to stand trial. He does not know if he will be released or if the emperor's executioner will take his head. Death is not an abstract theological concept for him right now. It is a very real possibility, looming just outside his cell door. Rome ruled the ancient world through one primary mechanism: fear. The empire held power because it held the power of the sword. If you rebelled, Rome could take your property, Rome could take your freedom, and ultimately, Rome could take your life. That is the ultimate leverage of any empire: submit or die. But Paul looks at the heaviest weapon the empire has. He looks at the threat of death, and he does not flinch. He does not cower. Instead, he reaches for a very specific vocabulary to describe his situation. He does not use mystical language. He does not use emotional language. He reaches into the ancient marketplace, and he pulls out the language of accountants. The word our English Bibles translate as gain is a startling choice. It is a word rooted in business, in trade, in the careful balancing of ledgers. Paul is looking at his life, looking at his impending trial, and crunching the numbers. He is calculating profit. Most people think this verse is a spiritual surrender, but Paul presents it as an economic victory. This completely changes the tone of the letter. If Paul is just tired and wants to go to heaven, then Rome still holds the power. Rome is the one forcing his hand. But if Paul is calculating a profit, then Rome has a massive problem. How do you intimidate a man who looks at the executioner's sword and sees a high-yield return on an investment? You cannot threaten a man with death if he has already categorized death as an upgrade. But Paul is not just writing poetry here. He is not using hyperbole to sound brave in front of his friends. He means this literally. He has built a mental balance sheet, and he is using a very specific word, a word from the noisy, ruthless merchant stalls of the ancient world that changes everything about how this sentence works. To see how this balance sheet works, we have to step back and look at the verses leading up to it. Paul is writing this letter to the church in Philippi. The Philippians lived in a proud Roman colony. They understood how the machinery of the empire worked. They knew that when a man was sent to prison under the threat of rebellion, the story rarely had a happy ending. Roman justice was cold, it was efficient, and it usually ended in blood. They are terrified for him. They are bracing for a tragedy. But starting in verse 12 of chapter 1, Paul completely disrupts their fear. He tells them that his imprisonment is not a failure. It is actually a new kind of strategy. He explains that because he is chained to a Roman soldier day and night, the entire imperial guard is being forced to listen to his message. Every shift change brings a new captive audience. This is not a man passively waiting for the end. This is a man who sees his prison cell as a pulpit. But the waiting cannot last forever. In verse 20, the tone shifts. The trial is looming. The Roman court will eventually call his name, and Paul must face the two possible verdicts: acquittal or execution, life or death. When an ordinary prisoner stands trial, the tension is unbearable because the empire holds all the cards. The equation of the courtroom is simple. To live is victory. To die is defeat. To live is success. To die is failure. Rome dictates the terms, and the prisoner hopes for mercy. But Paul refuses to accept those terms. He rewrites the equation. He tells his friends that his deepest hope is not that he will be released. His deepest hope is that Christ will be magnified in his body, whether by life or by death. Think about that word, magnified. To magnify something does not mean to change its actual size. It means to make its true, massive scale visible to people who cannot see it clearly. Paul looks at his physical body and realizes it is nothing more than a lens. If Rome releases him, he will use his walking, breathing, traveling body to magnify Jesus. If Rome condemns him, he will use his bleeding, breaking, dying body to do the exact same thing. Both outcomes are simply different tools for the same job. He has completely removed his own survival from the center of the story. That alone is a stunning subversion of imperial power. If you threaten a man with a sword, and he tells you he will simply use his execution to glorify his true king, you have no leverage left. You cannot terrorize a man who has surrendered the need to survive. But Paul is not finished. He does not stop with a beautiful, poetic statement of martyrdom. He pushes the logic past devotion, straight into economics. In verse 21, he drops the anchor of his entire argument. He writes, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." This is where the tension peaks. It is one thing to be willing to die for what you believe. Many brave people throughout history have been willing to die for a cause. But it is something entirely different to claim that dying actually leaves you richer. How can losing your earthly life be calculated as a surplus? To understand how Paul can look at the executioner's sword and see a literal advantage, we have to look closely at the Greek word he chooses for gain. How exactly can losing your earthly life be calculated as a surplus? The answer lies in the specific Greek word Paul chooses. The word is kerdos. It is a simple noun, but it carries immense practical weight. In the ordinary language of the first century, it meant profit. It meant an advantage. It was the word a merchant used at the end of a long season, when the ships returned to port and the cargo was sold for more than the journey cost. It was the word a tradesman wrote at the bottom of a ledger when the accounts were finally settled and the numbers were in the black. The English translation of gain is not wrong, but it can sometimes sound a little too abstract to modern ears. Today, we use the word loosely. We talk about gaining experience, or gaining a new perspective, or gaining a friend. But kerdos is sharper and more concrete. It begins with the idea of a measurable advantage. It is the literal, defining opposite of a loss. Now, bring that word into the shadow of a Roman prison cell. When human beings think of death, we naturally think of the ultimate deficit. Death strips away. Death subtracts. It takes away time. It takes away physical presence. It takes away the future we thought we were building. In every human economy, and especially in the ruthless, power-driven economy of the ancient world, death sits firmly, heavily, and permanently in the column of loss. But Paul takes this word of increase, this word of accumulated wealth and advantage, and he attaches it directly to the prospect of his own execution. He is telling his friends in Philippi, and by extension, he is telling the empire holding his chains, that if the sword falls, he will not simply be a victim. He will not just survive the transition. He will actually come out of the transaction richer than he was before. Pause for a second and see what is emerging here. So far, this has not been a random display of emotional bravery. Paul is making a careful theological assessment. He is weighing his breathing, speaking, walking life on one side of the scale. He is weighing his physical death on the other, and he concludes that dying actually advances his position. It is not an escape hatch. It is an upgrade. It is not a retreat. It is an acquisition. Many scholars note that Paul uses this kind of language deliberately. He is writing to people who understand what it means to calculate risk and reward. The Philippian church lived in a culture obsessed with status, achievement, and accumulation. They knew what it meant to spend your entire life trying to gain an advantage in society. Paul takes their entire framework of success and turns it upside down. He shows them that the ultimate advantage cannot be taken away by an emperor, because the ultimate advantage is found precisely where the emperor thinks he has the most power. But this raises a deeper question. A calculation like this does not work in a vacuum. You cannot have profit without a baseline. You cannot claim an advantage unless you are measuring it against a known value. If death is the profit, what is the principal investment? You cannot have profit without an investment. You cannot understand why death is a gain until you understand the exact currency Paul is using. To make sense of the word kerdos, we have to look at the first half of the sentence. We have to look at the other side of Paul's balance sheet. To make the math of the balance sheet work, we have to look closely at the first half of the sentence. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, begins with a radical definition. For to me, to live is Christ. Modern readers usually treat this as a statement of intense personal dedication. We hear it as a spiritual slogan. We assume Paul is simply saying, as long as I am breathing, I will do my best to serve Jesus. We treat Christ as an activity, a high priority, or a noble cause to live for. But that is not what the text says. Paul does not say, to live is to serve Christ. He does not say, to live is to honor Christ. He removes all the prepositions. He removes all the distance. He simply says, to live is Christ. In the original Greek phrasing, the sentence is even tighter. The connecting verb does not even appear in the text. It literally reads, for to me, to live, Christ. The two words are placed side by side. They are equivalent. Life and Christ are not two separate concepts that Paul is trying to hold together. For Paul, they are absolute synonyms. This is a massive shift in how a human being understands their own existence. For most people, faith is an important part of their lives, but Paul is not saying Jesus is a part of his life. He is saying Jesus is the literal, breathing substance of his life, not an addition. The foundation, not a priority. The reality, not just a cause to die for. The very definition of being alive. This mindset is not natural. Human beings are deeply wired for physical survival. We cling to our breath, our autonomy, our passing days. Rome counted on that biological instinct. The Caesars built an entire empire on the assumption that every human being fears the grave more than anything else. Now, bring the accountant's ledger back into the prison cell. Think about how we usually calculate value and loss. If a person defines their life by the accumulation of wealth, then death is an absolute loss, because they cannot take the silver with them. If a person defines their life by physical strength, then death is a tragedy, because the body finally breaks down. If a person defines their life by the freedom to go where they please, then the Roman Empire has already destroyed Paul's life by locking him in chains. But Paul has taken everything that matters to him, all his capital, all his hope, and he has placed it entirely in one single asset. He has defined his very existence by his union with the resurrected Jesus. And here is the unshakable logic of that decision. It is the only asset that death cannot steal. In fact, it is the only asset that death actually improves. If your entire life is defined by a person you love but cannot yet physically see, what happens when your physical body dies? You do not lose that person. You finally get them. The physical barrier is removed. The temporary veil is pulled back. You step into full, unhindered, unmediated fellowship with the one who already holds your heart. You move from the shadow to the substance, from the down payment to the full inheritance. That is why the ancient word for profit fits perfectly. If you hold a small portion of something beautiful, and physical death suddenly hands you the limitless ocean of it, that is not a deficit. The calculation is mathematically sound. But once you realize that Christ is the absolute baseline of Paul's existence, a profound paradox emerges. The math creates a reality that Rome cannot handle, one that strips the empire of all its terrifying power over him. Think about the exact nature of the trap Paul has just built for his captors. Rome executes dissidents for a very specific reason. to silence them. The entire point of the sword is to stop the spread of a dangerous idea. But what happens to the empire when the execution itself becomes the loudest possible broadcast of that idea? Paul spells out this dilemma clearly. In verse 22, he looks at the first option. He writes, "If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me." Look at what he is saying. If the Roman court acquits him, if they unlock his chains and let him walk out of the prison, he is not going to quietly retire. He is going to go right back to work. He will keep planting churches. He will keep writing letters. He will keep raising up leaders who refuse to call Caesar Lord. If Rome lets him live, he multiplies. He is contagious. And from the empire's perspective, that is a disaster. So, the logical imperial move is to silence him. The logical move is the executioner's block. But then Paul introduces the second option. In verse 23, he says, "I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far." The English phrase, "better by far," is almost too polite. The original Greek phrasing is intensely emphatic. It is a double comparative. Paul is stacking words on top of each other to express an overwhelming, incalculable advantage. It is not just better. It is much, much better. This is the ultimate neutralization of imperial power. Look at the checkmate he has constructed. If Rome lets him live, he expands the kingdom of God on earth. If Rome kills him, they instantly give him his deepest desire and usher him into the immediate, unhindered presence of the true king. It is a lose-lose for the empire. It is a win-win for the prisoner. Rome has absolutely no leverage left. They cannot threaten him with pain because he has already surrendered his body. They cannot threaten him with death because he has already categorized death as a massive promotion. To understand how completely Paul has defeated the fear of death here, look closely at the word he uses when he says he desires to depart. The Greek word is anulo. It is a fascinating, highly visual word. It was commonly used in the ancient world for striking a camp. It is what soldiers did when they pulled up the stakes of their tents to move on. It was also used by sailors. It is the word for unmooring a ship, untying the ropes from the dock so the vessel can finally set sail into the open water. Notice the imagery. Not destruction, transition, not an ending, and unmooring. Paul is not talking about his existence being extinguished by a Roman blade. He is talking about pulling up the stakes of a temporary campsite. He is talking about untying the ropes so he can finally launch into the deep. Death is simply the moment the ropes are cut. When your entire life is defined by Christ, the severing of those earthly ropes does not sink the ship, it frees it. That is the unbreakable logic of a Christ-centered life. This logic is airtight. It is a stunning display of spiritual resilience, but it raises a profound question. How did a man who used to be a violent, status-obsessed Pharisee reach the point where he no longer cared about his own earthly survival? Paul actually reveals the depth of this accounting system 2 chapters later, where he shows us exactly what he had to place in the loss column before he could ever call death a gain. To see the full balance sheet, we have to flip forward. The logic of Philippians chapter 1 does not exist in isolation. Paul actually shows us his exact accounting method 2 chapters later. In Philippians chapter 3, starting in verse 4, Paul lists his previous credentials. Before he met Jesus, he was not a marginalized man. He was an absolute elite. He had the perfect religious pedigree. He was circumcised on the 8th day, born of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He was trained in the strictest schools and possessed a flawless record of law observance. In the social and religious economy of the first century, he was a billionaire. He had accumulated everything a person could possibly want to gain. But then, in verses 7 and 8, he applies the exact same vocabulary we saw back in his Roman prison cell. He writes, "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ." Notice the plural, gains. He is talking about his entire resume, all his earthly advantages, all his safety, all his pride, and then he pushes the calculation even further. He says, "What is more, I consider everything a loss, because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. In the Greek text, Paul uses the exact same accounting terms. He uses the word for profit, kerdos, and he introduces its direct opposite, the word for loss, zemia. This is not a gentle word. In the ancient world, zemia was often used in the shipping industry to describe a catastrophic loss at sea. When a cargo ship was caught in a massive storm, the sailors would have to take all their precious merchandise and physically throw it overboard just to keep the ship from sinking. That desperate throwing away of treasure was called a zemia, a total write-off. This is the moment Paul's ledger is completely rewritten. He takes every single thing that gave him earthly identity, every single thing that gave him power, and he manually moves it from the asset column to the liability column. He throws all of his social capital overboard, not a minor adjustment, a complete bankruptcy. He does this for one singular reason, so that he can gain Christ. There is that word again, gain. If you understand Philippians chapter 3, you finally understand Philippians chapter 1. You cannot look at an executioner's sword and call it a gain unless you have already practiced losing everything else. Paul is not afraid of losing his physical life in chapter 1 because he already threw his earthly life overboard in chapter 3. The transaction is already complete. Rome is threatening to take away something that Paul has already discarded in order to give him the only thing he actually wants. The empire is completely disarmed by a man who has already declared his own bankruptcy. When you read the letter this way, the famous verse changes completely. To die is gain is no longer a morbid wish for an escape. It is the bulletproof joy of a man who knows his accounts are forever settled. The math is done. The bottom line is perfectly secure. Paul has calculated the cost of everything. He has weighed his life, his death, his imprisonment, and his future. He has built a theological architecture that no human threat can ever tear down. But when he finally makes his choice between life and death back in chapter 1, he does something that completely reverses our modern ideas of spirituality. When modern believers think about heaven, we often treat it as the ultimate personal reward. It is an escape from a broken world, a final exit from pain. If most of us were given a choice between immediate, unhindered paradise and staying in a cold Roman prison to face more beatings, the decision would take about 1 second. We would take the exit. We would take the gain. But Paul pauses. He has just spent the entire chapter proving that death is an absolute advantage. He has mathematically calculated that the executioner's sword is his fastest route to the only person he actually wants. The ropes are ready to be cut. The ship is ready to sail. And then he turns the advantage down. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 24, the brilliant accounting logic hits a wall. Paul writes, "But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." Look at the tension he is holding. He is staring at the two ledgers. On one side, he writes, "Depart and be with Christ, the ultimate profit, the end of the pain." On the other side, he writes, "Stay in the physical body, more chains, more riots, more danger." And he chooses the chains. This completely shatters our modern ideas of spiritual victory. We tend to think that spiritual success means finally arriving at a place of personal peace and comfort. But Paul realizes that the logic of "to live is Christ" does not just mean feeling close to Jesus. It means acting exactly like him. Think about the pattern Paul is following here. The church in Philippi would hear this letter read aloud, and they would immediately recognize the rhythm. Who else in this exact letter possessed every possible heavenly advantage, but chose to step into human suffering for the sake of others? It is the core message of Philippians chapter 2. Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. He emptied himself. He took the form of a servant. He delayed his own comfort for the sake of human rescue. Paul is simply walking in the footsteps of his King. He is imitating the incarnation. He realizes that if his existence is truly and entirely defined by Christ, then his existence must be defined by self-giving love. He cannot claim to be united with a crucified Savior if he uses his very first opportunity to abandon the church just to get his own reward. Not a tired man giving up, a transformed man digging in, not a victim of Rome, a servant of the church. In verse 25, he makes his final assessment. He says, "Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith." Do you hear the absolute selflessness in those words? He is saying, I am completely ready for the prophet, but you are not ready for me to leave. Your progress matters more than my relief. My gain can wait, because your faith still needs a foundation. This destroys the assumption that Paul is writing a depressing letter from a dark place. A depressed man takes the exit. A completely free man stands at the open doorway of paradise, looks back at the people who still need him, and willingly steps back into the prison cell. Death is a gain, yes, but love is a responsibility. He delays his own inheritance so the Philippian believers can continue to build theirs. He leverages his own life to secure their future. This decision pulls the entire theology out of the clouds and places it firmly in the dirt of ordinary relationships. It shows us what a Christ-centered life actually looks like when the pressure is at its highest. Paul's decision reveals the true heartbeat of a Christ-centered life, and it leaves us with a final, unavoidable question about how we view our own mortality. Let us look back at the entire pattern we have uncovered. We started with a familiar sentence that most people read as a tired sigh of resignation. To die is gain. We usually assume it means escaping a hard, painful life, to go to a peaceful place. We treat it like an exit strategy. But Paul is not writing an exit strategy. He is writing a manifesto of absolute freedom. He reaches into the noise of the ancient marketplace and borrows the language of merchants and accountants. The word is kerdos, profit, advantage, a massive return on investment. He builds a balance sheet where his very existence is defined by one single, unbreakable asset, Jesus Christ. Because Paul has already moved his earthly pride, his social status, his safety, and his physical survival into the loss column, he has absolutely nothing left for the empire to threaten. Rome can only terrorize you if it can threaten what you are trying to keep. Paul is not trying to keep anything. That is the hidden architecture of a truly Christ-centered life. It completely dismantles the machinery of fear, and it fundamentally changes how we are meant to view our own mortality. For all of human history, death has been the great thief. It operates by subtraction. It steals time. It steals physical presence. It steals the future we thought we were building. But Paul looks at the great thief and realizes that because of the resurrection of Jesus, the thief has been completely repurposed. Death can no longer subtract Christ from him. It can only remove the physical veil. It can only deliver him into Christ's immediate, unfiltered presence. The ultimate enemy has been turned into a delivery system, not an ending, but a doorway. Not the loss of life, but the culmination of it. But the deepest beauty of this pattern is what Paul actually does with his newfound freedom. He does not use his spiritual advantage to abandon his friends. He holds the winning ticket. He has mathematically proven that stepping onto the executioner's block will bring him his deepest desire. He looks at the open door of paradise, and then he deliberately turns his back to it. He chooses to stay in the chains. He chooses to keep serving. This is what the modern world so often misses about biblical hope. We often treat the hope of heaven as a reason to care less about the earth. But in Paul's precise logic, heavenly hope is exactly what gives you the stamina to care more. When you are no longer terrified of losing your own life, you are finally, truly free to give it away. Paul stays for the joy of the Philippian church. He stays for their progress. He proves that the ultimate mark of spiritual maturity is not how quickly you can escape this broken world, but how fiercely you are willing to love the people still living in it. The entire letter to the Philippians hinges on this radical logic. It is a letter of relentless, defiant joy, written from a place of absolute physical vulnerability by a man who knows his accounts are forever settled. The math is done. The ledger is perfectly balanced. The baseline is secure. If this journey through Paul's letter has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next deep dive into the biblical text. The phrase was never just a tired wish for heaven. It was the unshakable logic of a man who had already conquered the grave.